everybody. We want to thank you for joining our program today. This is a new programming that we're starting out of an organization called People's Visioning. We are here to bring and implement solutions to social, environmental, economic injustice kinds of issues here that all of our communities are facing in different ways. And we are hoping to share our work and create new People's Visioning chapters across the state and beyond to help us have a platform for being able to bring a new vision that would help resolve many of the problems that we're seeing in our society and in our governance at large. And today we're going to be talking about the piece of that that all of us are hugely concerned with is our food. And two other pieces that also interrelate to our food would be our economics and even our energy piece, because we'll be talking about the farms, and we'll probably touch on how those other pieces interrelate with food in our conversation today. I have with me a guest who is extremely notable. We're very happy to have Dr. John Eichard joining us today. And Dr. Eichard has himself grown up on a small farm. I'll let him tell you a little more about that in a second, but he's also spent the body of his life's work in this area of sustainable, well, he can tell you that too. It eventually came around to be sustainable agriculture. And that's the focus of People's Visioning. The vision is a sustainable food model and interrelated model to the energy and economics. And so Dr. Eichard is a professor emeritus from the University of Missouri here in Columbia, where we're taping. He used to be a Columbia resident, and he has a long history. So I'm going to ask Dr. Eichard to kind of fill in that sketch for us a little bit, if he would.
All right. Very good. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you, and I kind of applaud your efforts to open up the dialogue and conversation on issues of sustainability. That's really what I'm trying to do. I often say when I start speaking, I say, what I speak is my truth, and if someone else's truth is different from mine, then that's all right with me, because I don't think any of us should be so egotistical as to think that only we have the truth.
Yes, we agree.
I do speak my truth with conviction because I know why I believe what I believe, and I respect other people's truth when they know why they believe what they believe. And I think just because some so-called expert said something or you read it somewhere is not a very good reason to believe anything. So I believe in looking at all sides of the issues, and I've looked at different sides of the issues during my life and my career. And I'll be very brief in this, but I grew up on a small dairy farm down in southwest Missouri. And then I was lucky enough at that time to be able to go to the University of Missouri, and eventually got my bachelor's and master's and PhD degrees from the University of Missouri. And in between my bachelor's and master's work, I worked for 3 years with Wilson Packing Company. At that time, that was the 4th largest meat packing company in the country at that time. So I've got some experience kind of in the food industry as well. And then after I got my degree, then I worked for 30 years in 4 different land-grant universities, agricultural colleges at North Carolina State University, Oklahoma State University, University of Georgia, and then I finished my career here at the University of Missouri. And the first half of that academic career, I was a livestock marketing specialist. I was an agricultural economist, but I focused on livestock marketing issues. And I was one of these professors that told farmers at that time that farming as a way of life was out of date, and farming had to be a business, and you had to farm for the economic bottom line. And I was one of them that told them, you either have to get big or get out of agriculture, because it's all about becoming efficient, specialized, standardized, consolidation of control, which meant larger and larger farms. And now we see even corporate control of agriculture with the large corporations.
And by the corporate control, I want to let
Sure.
you finish, but I want to interject this point is to make it really clear, because we'll be talking also about
Sure.
Amendment 1 today. And
Right.
the folks that are opposed to Amendment 1 are sometimes misunderstood with the corporate control that they're pointing out, because a lot of small farmers do have small family corporations, LLCs,
Right.
whatever. But I think that it's important to differentiate the corporate control, which would be
Yeah.
the national, multinational.
Yes, it is. This is probably a good point at which to explain that difference, because it is tremendously important. Now, a family corporation or a closely held corporation where people have deeply shared ethical and social values, like a family is no different than the individual. They can decide as a family or a closely held corporation that we're going to express our social and ethical values in the way that we operate the business. In other words, we're willing to sacrifice in some cases some of the potential profitability or economic gains if it compromises our social values, or if it compromises our ethical values, or it does something harmful to our neighbors.
Because
Now,
we're
when
because
yeah.
we're benefiting.
Yeah, because you're benefiting. Now, from the standpoint of the large publicly held corporation, what you have in that case is you have thousands of shareholders, maybe millions of shareholders, and they're scattered all around the world in many cases. And they have no common social values because they come from all different religions, ethnicities, different countries, different communities, different age levels, different education,
Right.
and so on. Or they have no common ethical values if they're coming from different religious backgrounds and things of this nature. And so the corporation as a legal entity has a legal responsibility to serve the common interest of the shareholders. And the only common interest in those cases is the desire to increase the value of their investments in that company.
So one thing is economic.
Right, and so
Personal.
a large corporation ends up being a purely economic individual or a purely economic entity because it has no capacity for developing common social or ethical values. And
Right.
if you want to go even further, when most of the corporate stock, a large share of it is held by pension funds and mutual funds, people don't even know which pieces of companies they own. How can they express their social and ethical values? Or when we have
Right.
electronic trading, you may only own a stock for a second or a fraction of a second. How can you express your social and ethical values there?
Right.
So back to kind of my story where I realized this consolidation, was going on, and that's what I was telling farmers to do. During the farm financial crisis, I still refer to that as the 1980s. We can go into it more if you want to, but farmers, due to circumstances, I argue that were not their fault, basically doing what we so-called experts were telling them to do, ended up with huge debts at high interest rates, and then they were dependent upon export markets, and the global economy went into a recession, the export markets dried up, and they were caught with debts that they could not repay. And so I still remember it very well. The foreclosures and bankruptcies were on the network news programs almost every night, 2 or 3 times a week. And I had gone to the University of Georgia at that time. I was head of the Extension Agricultural Economics Department. And our responsibility then was to try to go out and help these farmers, figure out some way to save the farm. And we had several farmers in Georgia that committed suicide because they lost their farm. Well, in talking with those farmers, I came to the realization, that the ones that had the biggest problems were the ones that had been following what we so-called experts had been telling them what to do. And I said, look, there's something fundamentally wrong with the economics that I had been taught. There's something fundamentally wrong with the agriculture I'd been promoting, this economic model. And so I concluded I couldn't continue to promote and support that vision. And it was a very difficult situation, but then about that time, the sustainable agriculture movement was coming on. So sustainable agriculture gave me something, that I could begin to kind of help understand and articulate what sustainability was about and what sustainable agriculture was about. And I've really been on that journey ever since, maybe the past 25 years.
Yeah, and so that takes us now to people's visioning again, which is trying to implement a sustainable vision in these different areas, the food, the energy, and the economics. And because of that vision, and people are welcome to join us because we do welcome everyone's
Sure.
Opinion, and we do have to, in a polite way, interact with one another, help educate each other to each
Sure.
other's issues, and see how we can move forward as a society to create something better. And out of that, we learned about this constitutional amendment
Right.
that's going to be up for vote here in August 5th, and we took a strong stand to oppose the constitutional amendment for a great number of reasons. We'll go into those a little bit later, but I did want to say that one thing that is really crux at the bottom of it is this sustainable versus unsustainable model. Right. And we're sort of having a head-butting moment in society. Right. That these two models are opposing, and they ultimately can't coexist because the unsustainable model is eventually it's just simply not sustainable, and it's going to cause too much damage over time. Eventually, we will go to the sustainable model, except that we'd like to lessen the damage that happens in the meantime. Absolutely. And so that kind of takes us to this Constitutional Amendment 1, which is one side of that, the unsustainable side, saying we are instituting in the Constitution protections for all of us, the sustainable and the unsustainable side. But the folks on the sustainable side say, hey, wait a minute, we don't really think that that's how that's going to play out. Right. And we think that it's going to play out in the courts because the language is too vague. I can read it here in a minute. But it also, because it's so broad, it gives protections to these types of bigger corporate entities, not the small farmer corporate entities. It does technically protect across the board, but when you have deeper, bigger pockets in a court of law where these contentions will play out, and you have a constitutional amendment which trumps the other laws, the statutes that already have been working actually quite well and have been reflecting this broader public as well, because there was the vote in 2010 that was brought against the puppy mills, and folks do seem to think that this is a bit of a fanned flame of fear that folks would then try to regulate food-producing animals, which really are a very different thing than dogs, because here in our country we don't eat dogs, although some countries dogs might be considered food. But here, regardless of that piece, the humane aspects of treating any animal, whether it's the puppy mills or whether it might be pigs in a larger confined animal feeding operation, a CAFO, C-A-F-O, or any of the other animals that would be in these confined operations. Maybe it's, cows or cattle or chickens or whatever. So there is a strong feeling from the public that they want their food to be handled both ethically in all the different kinds of ways, whether it's the humane treatment of animals, whether it's the humane treatment of the rest of society, because we're not polluting the planet so much that we can't safely, breathe our air, drink our water, and eat our food. So I'll let you speak to some of that a little bit.
Right. Well, what I think is I think the what I call the agricultural establishment, and that would include the large agribusiness corporations, but also organizations such as the Farm Bureau that basically promotes industrial agriculture, the large commodity associations, the pork producers, dairy producers, grain producers, corn producers, so on.
Folks like Cargill and even Smithton and Monsanto that operate.
As well as the large commodity organizations that's supposed to represent farmers, but they represent the larger farmers because they're more interested in production than they are in people, because that's where their revenue comes from.
The bigger model, like you were saying.
Yeah. So, I think it would also include the agricultural establishment, would include the large agricultural colleges and the U.S. Department of Agriculture and state departments of agriculture that are promoting sort of this industrial model of agriculture. And so I think the agricultural establishment was looking for an opportunity to do something like the constitutional amendment, because they recognize that there's growing public concern about the overall integrity of the food system. And they're trying to, as I call it, build a firewall to keep the public from imposing regulations on the industry of agriculture that would address these issues of emerging public concern. And I can name you a few. Food safety issues is right at the top of the list. You know, we're told by the agricultural establishment we have the safest, most healthful food system in the world, whereas in reality, food recalls, massive recalls of food for contamination with salmonella and E. coli and various other reasons have become almost routine. They hardly bother to report them unless somebody dies of it anymore. But you can go online and you can see these massive recalls that are taking place.
I'm sure everyone listening knows of these.
And what's even more bothersome about that, the recent studies have indicated that roughly half of the bacteria that they find in food in the supermarkets in these studies are antibiotic resistant. They're resistant to a range of antibiotics that are used in humans, and probably the most common term is the MRSA, the multi-antibiotic resistant sort of bacteria that kills more people in the United States today than AIDS does. And so, you know, the food supply is contaminated in general with biological organisms. In fact, you know, they treat chickens almost as a hazardous waste products. They don't put it on the counter. You got to wash your hands. You got to cook it thoroughly. Just assume that it's contaminated. So there's growing concern about this, and particularly the antibiotic resistance is really becoming a major issue in this country because we're running out of antibiotics. The environmental issues that they're concerned about. You know, again, the agricultural establishment says that farmers are stewards of the land, and many of them are good stewards of the land. But you can't deny the fact when the EPA comes up, there's 35,000 miles of polluted streams in the 19 Midwestern states that are polluted by agricultural chemicals and biological waste from these large-scale confinement animal feeding operations.
And they're just facts. This
It's
is just a fact.
And they say, you know, the establishment again says, well, we have modern manure management plans, we have precision farming, so we're doing a better job now of keeping these out of the streams. Well, if that's the case, then why have we had a threefold increase in the number of impaired streams in the state of Iowa since the year of 2000? What's happened in the state of Iowa since 2000? Increase in corn production to produce ethanol, which means increased use of chemicals, increased pesticides, fertilizers, runoff, and a big increase in the number of large-scale confinement animal feeding operations.
The CAFOs.
Yeah, and we have three times as many streams now as when we were producing most of the hogs in individually owned family farming kinds of hog operations, and more streams polluted now than we had when we were at a more reasonable level of corn production, producing corn on good corn producing land, and had land in conservation reserve programs. So,
and these big CAFO operations, they devalue the land of the farmers around them. We're talking farmer rights, one right of a certain type of so-called farmer versus other rights of other farmers, because they're really, the farmers in the CAFOs are really more like hired hands, or they're a partner in some way, but they have relinquished a great deal of being realistically calling this a farm.
Just to go beyond that, I discovered recently in the state of Iowa, I'm on the board of directors of a group within our county that's concerned about these same issues in my new hometown of Fairfield, Iowa, Jefferson County, Farmers and Neighbors. And in the process of our work, we discovered that in the state of Iowa, the operator of the confinement facility, who we would call the farmer, is no longer considered the manager of that farming operation or that production operation. So when we were looking into if an individual manager or farmer expands beyond a certain size, then they become subject to higher levels of regulation. Well, we found out that it's the corporation that the farmer contracts with that is actually the farm manager.
And call the shots. Yeah.
Legally, the person that owns the buildings and owns the land is called the farm worker, a worker for the corporation. So you can see how far we've gone in that direction.
Right.
I think one of the biggest issues that we're confronted with today is this. It's not just one kind of farmer out there anymore. It's not just the family farmer that goes all the way across the board. It's the large-scale industrial farming operation, specialized, standardized, consolidation of control. And increasingly, these large operations are under a contractual arrangement of one kind or another with the large corporations. The last USDA Census of Agriculture indicated about 95% of our poultry now is produced in these highly integrated operations where the farmer would be considered a farm worker or the producer. and over about 45% of our hogs are in those operations. But in reality, the influence of these large agribusiness processors and packers basically dominate those whole sectors. And increasingly that's becoming the case in dairy as well. And,
yeah. And so these are the kinds of corporations that People's Visioning and others who are opposed. Missouri's Food for America is sort of an umbrella group that's that all of us who are opposing vote the Amendment 1, which is this constitutional amendment that folks will have a chance to vote on August 5th. And we do encourage folks to learn more. We'll talk just a little bit more here about that, but we have an opportunity to help move our food farming towards a more sustainable model by voting no, actually. Opposing, in this case, is a good thing for Constitutional Amendment 1 on the August 5th ballot. And it's really very important to get the word out because several things. We smaller folks, the people, the small farmers, and by the way, some of the folks that are in this umbrella group are working together. In addition to People's Visioning, are folks like the Missouri Farmers Union, and these are the small farms that are in more of a sustainable model and really have a legitimate way to call themselves the family farms rather than these factory farms, essentially. And I think most folks know what a factory farm is, and they know it's not probably the best model, actually, and it certainly isn't a small farmer. And the proponents are using their publicity language saying that, you know, this is really all about protecting small farmers. So there's really a lot of, well, I would say it's disingenuous at the very kindest information that is being shared with the public, and that folks with the shallow pockets are trying to get the word out to help connect the dots. And that's part of what our program today is, to educate all of us a little bit more about this food system in general, because it's a little bit complex. And so it's hard in a little soundbite to kind of say, why do you want to vote no? So we could kind of summarize some really good big reasons. But in addition to the Farmers Union, there are a lot of small farmers who are endorsing this. And they don't have the deep pockets, and we need everyone's help. You can connect with us. You'll see ways to connect on your screen here in a little bit with People's Visioning. We need help with getting signs made and donations. We need help to spread the word. We're going to ask folks to each tell 10 of your friends about this whole issue, and to ask them to tell friends, because it's kind of a David and Goliath situation right now, as you can hear Dr. Eichert saying, with these large corporations that have one goal, which is their economic gain, is their tasked bottom line. And these other farmers do certainly want to make a living, but they also understand passing down their farm in good health to their progeny, the future generations. And these large models essentially ruin and pollute things. I know that in Iowa, some of the folks are talking about, and there's been editorials, some well-known pundits and others are saying, we are now the toilet of the Midwest. It's this bad about how far things have gone. And we in Missouri can say, hey, they're showing us in Iowa and Illinois that this is a pretty bad model. We are concerned that with this language, CAFOs will sprout up everywhere. The proponents are trying to tell you that won't happen, that with this, local control is regained, but it's not so. No. There's only two cities in the two large cities, St. Louis and Kansas City, have any protections in that way. So that, again, is disingenuous information in a kind way. But outright threats to a lot of our communities. Somebody could build a CAFO right here outside of Columbia or Ashland or any of our communities, and our communities would suffer. So maybe they build it out in the country. Well, the farming neighbors suffer. So there's a tremendous amount of pollution, and these large companies are looking for more land to go to where the people aren't wise yet because they're getting they're kind of getting some kickback from the communities in these other states. One is your state.
Sure.
And so as the Show Me State, we certainly hope we can look and see what's happening in these other states, but even here in our own state, because we have a couple of good examples. We have things that have happened just this year, a couple months ago, or a month and a half ago, a spill in the Tyson meatpacking plant that killed fish in from Monette down to the next town. And we've had the next largest town, I can't remember the name of that, but you can Google information on any of these things we're talking about to verify what we're saying today. And we actually encourage you to do that, to learn more and to share with your neighbors. But also the example of Smithfield Farms and the pollution that it's causing to its neighbor, which is a huge CAFO now, and the neighbors fought it like they're trying to do, fight a CAFO going on over in Callaway County near Hatton and Fulton. And that's quite near really to Columbia as well, and Ashland. It's in our neck of the woods for sure. So we could definitely all be having wider impacts, and I know there's actually really a CAFO that already exists, but it's been limited. There was an agreement between the neighbors several decades ago when the first large confined operation was put in to say, you know, you can't put in anymore, and this farmer neighbor agreed, but now they're kind of going back on that. So I guess a lot of us need to do some soul searching inside. How much money is enough for us? You know, where does our level of need and or the word greed come into play? And our investments, you know, if we are invested, what companies do we want to ethically support? So, you know, the Smithfield operation couldn't even happen without the legislators doing what they're attempting to do now and taking the opportunity, as you say. And that couldn't even have happened if they didn't change our laws to limit foreign ownership, which goes back to a point of what you were talking about earlier with these
increasing control. Smithfield, or I guess it's Shengwei, is the company, Chinese company that now owns Smithfields. By far the largest hog producer in the state of Missouri, largest hog producer in the country. So they would be covered by the right to farm.
They would be.
Some of my colleagues are saying, you know, the biggest fault with it, it gives corporations, these giant corporations, the same rights as the independent family farmers.
Exactly.
And independent family farmers already have a right to farm law that protects them from frivolous nuisance suits by neighbors that don't understand agriculture and things of this nature.
Right.
If I had
that protection's there.
If I had to sum up the real problem of the Amendment 1 in a very short sentence, it would be that what it would do would prevent the future regulation of these large factory farming operations that are posing increasing risk to public health and public safety through pollution of the environment and through the practices such as routine feeding of antibiotics and things of this nature. It would be like granting them the right to farm would be the right to continue those practices such as use of genetically modified crops and routine use of antibiotics and things of this nature indefinitely into the future. And that would be like saying, back in 1970s when I first went to North Carolina, which was the biggest tobacco producing state in the country, probably still is. And tobacco basically was the foundation of North Carolina agriculture. And there were just beginning to be concerns at that point in the early 70s. A few studies come out linking tobacco smoking and health issues. But of course, the state of North Carolina, the agricultural establishment there was in total denial. They say there's no proof, there's a few studies, this is Indian news. These are people trying to destroy our agriculture and things that the same stories you hear here. So what if we had granted a right to smoke in the early 70s that said smokers and tobacco companies can continue to do what they're doing now forever?
Carte blanche, anything they want.
And so over time, as the evidence mounted and the public consensus developed, then we began to regulate smoking. We began to regulate the tobacco companies. We restricted advertising. We restricted sales and trying to addict children on tobacco. And we eventually restricted secondhand smoke so that you didn't have to die of someone else's cancer from someone else's smoke. But those laws and those regulations would have all been precluded if we had granted a constitutional right of smokers and tobacco companies, which we're trying to do to farmers. Well, we need to come to the realization, for example, that when we have 2,500 hogs out here, which is right at the level of the large CAFOs, the bottom side of that, not big by today's standards, we're looking at the equivalent of a town of 7,500 people. And we're saying you can take the effluent or the waste from 7,500 people and basically spread it right next to people's backyards. Maybe not in the backyards, but right next to the back.
Right.
If you have 200 dairy cows out here, you have a town like a town of 4,000 people, or 400 dairy cows, 8,000 people. And so over time then, of the biological waste, over time then, if we just say, okay, we need to regulate these operations in order to protect public health. Or we say over time, there's a growing body of evidence, a new study come out from the Center for Disease Control that has a clear statement in it that says antibiotic resistance is becoming a major public concern in the US and globally. And they clearly state that scientists from around the world have linked antibiotic resistance to the routine feeding of antibiotics to animals in large confinement animal feeding operations. Okay, what if we develop a consensus that we not only have to give advisories like they're doing now about the use of antibiotics, but we need to regulate the use of antibiotics in order to protect public health. We wouldn't be able to do that if they had a constitutional right to continue doing what they do now.
Exactly.
I'm reading a book, I'm reviewing a book now on what went on with the approval of genetically modified organisms. It's written by the lawyer who represented 12, I think it's either 9 or 12 scientists that sued the FDA for not doing the legally required risk assessment that was required for genetically modified organisms. I'm not saying one way or the other, but what if we conclude, as the evidence is growing, that there are really public health risks associated with continuing to use genetically engineered crops? We wouldn't be able to do anything about it. I think this law is intentionally designed to preclude the public from protecting itself in the future in these areas where there's growing public concern about the integrity of our food system.
And that's pretty much what the proponents will say, but just not exactly in that way.
Right.
But that's exactly more or less what they will say. I went to one of their meetings just last night, and they more or less say, well, there's pushback, and it's growing over even some decades,
Right.
and so they see this, and that's essentially what they're saying. We're protecting ourselves against that, and
Right.
and so we just say, it's one group of rights, whether it's the farmer to farmer in these certain areas, or whether it's the public at large to this farming operation.
And in cases in a democracy, the public interest trumps the individual economic interest when it comes to issues of public health. That's one thing that the Supreme Court has consistently upheld, that you can even restrict interstate commerce whenever it's necessary to protect the public health. And this would preclude the possibility that we could do that in the future. And so, and as an economist, they argue in the legislative language that supports this constitutional amendment. They talk about agriculture being the economic foundation of the country, and economic being essential for food and things of this nature. But as an economist, I can tell you that these large-scale operations have not led over the past 20 years for a reduction in food costs. In fact, over the past 20 years, food costs have gone up faster than the rate of inflation. You can look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. We've averaged anywhere from 2 to 4% annual increases in food costs over the past 20 years.
And I think people really, they go to the grocery store, they get that.
Yeah, and any
show me factor there.
Any economic benefit from this model that I was promoting, to bring down the cost of food, any economic benefit's been taken by the agribusiness that do the processing, distribution, retailing of food. And it goes to their shareholders, not a benefit to the general public.
Or to the small farmer.
Yeah, or the small farmers, or the small farmers are still going out of business as the big ones take over their operations. It hasn't gone to the economic benefit of rural communities. You don't benefit when you have a CAFO. You end up with more cost to fix the roads and the bridges and to deal with environmental problems and to pick up dead animals and things of this nature. then you gain in benefits. The people that work in these operations in general are not people that were unemployed in those communities before. There are people that are brought into those communities from other places, in many cases from other countries. And I'm certainly not opposed to immigration or this sort of thing, but it's not going to provide increased employment for the unemployed there. And when people move into a community, they bring with them their need for education and health care and all of the public services.
All the other extended things.
And so their demand on public services often exceed whatever they contribute to the tax base. So rural communities don't benefit economically from this, and the consumer doesn't. And in fact, if you look at the statistics, then you see what it's all about. Today, approximately 30% of the cash income, and this is according to USDA statistics, of American farmers is accounted for by exports. We're increasing CAFOs tremendously in the state of Iowa recently, but it's all gearing up for the Chinese market. And we talked about a Chinese company buying out Smithfield Packing Company. Produces 27% of the hogs in this country. They're producing those hogs to export. So we export the meat not to feed the hungry Chinese, but the increasingly affluent class that's rising out of the economic growth. And we end up with our communities destroyed, our streams polluted. We end up with the waste and they end up with the meat. And then on the crop side, it's not to feed people. We've been producing it for ethanol. We burn 40% of our corn crop in our cars. We're not feeding the hungry people of the world with that. We're not bringing down U.S. food costs. There's really no economic benefits to outweigh the risk of not being able to impose the restrictions that we may need in the future.
And so the sustainable model is where we, almost anybody can see that's where we have to go. We have to go to a sustainable model. No one can even argue that. Ultimately, I mean, they might try, but all they would end up saying is, well, this model is eventually that this isn't sustainable. But the problem is, in the process, we destroy so much. In China, they have, because they don't have regulations, or maybe education as well, but they have destroyed like 40% of their good land that they can do things with. And so we need a sustainable model to feed the world, everyone, everywhere, because I know that there have, people say, well, or at least some farmers say and others say, well, you can't, feed the world with these, say, organic small farms. But Will Allen, I believe is his name. Anyway, you can Google this as well. Urban small organic farm can feed 10,000 people a year off of a 3-acre urban farm. And Russia has, they say that they can do 71% off of their smaller sustainable model, like we're talking about, that model that is, and clearly, as you've laid out, the unsustainable folks see that model as competition. And so it really is this headbutting struggle, and it's taking place unfairly in our government. And this is where we have Princeton University has come out and said, our government is no longer a democracy. It's actually, we've done these studies and we define it as an oligarchy right now, which is essentially certain wealthy companies and lobbyists, are the ones who have the influence and move our policy. And so, as you've pointed out, sort of an opportunistic time, and some might say a knee-jerk reaction, but really an opportunist time from these folks who kind of have a vision of their own that they've been implementing. And so people can Google, and I'd encourage them to learn more about both the Koch brothers and some of the organizations that they support, KOCH, and an organization called American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC or ALEC. And this language here, I'll ask you to read it in a minute, Dr. Eichert, because it might prompt you to say something. But this language, maybe with some of your 10 points or whatever, this language comes from the ALEC model language that they send to state houses and to our national government to get policies. And it's a huge part of why we're now an oligarchy. and the public has to come together. We need a platform to come together with. So we're offering People's Visioning and other organizations that we ally with. We have right now 10 co-sponsoring organizations under our own umbrella. But we'd love to work, not just in Missouri, but around the nation, because we have a huge problem and the public needs to become engaged. Otherwise, they're going to be part of the problem. And so many of the young people today and folks, that are spending more time with the television, because we hope that they'll view this program and think about it and maybe still watch television because there's a lot of good programming, but use a big slice of their life to say, I've got to do something different. I've got to become
Sure.
more active on these issues, because a lot of times the younger generation can just think, and a lot of us can think, oh, this is so overwhelming, we can't make a difference, let's just, go off and live it up, and, that's all
Sure.
all the time we've got left. But we really have to counter that notion among ourselves and realize that we can do something, that there's a lot of positive people power
Sure.
gains that are being made as people are trying to come together and wake up others and build this people's movement to essentially take back or clean up our own government, or even create something new. In People's Visioning, we're open, as we said, to all viewpoints, but we do uphold that, this public good, not socialism exactly, of any
Sure.
of that kind of thing, because a lot of people come out and say, oh, well, that. But the recognition that, we have rights. We have the right to an individual right. We have the right to swing our arms as widely as we want, but that right stops at the other person's
Sure.
nose. So, and that's not socialism. That's just, like you
Sure.
said also,
It's democracy.
it's democracy.
Yeah, it
it's
really
public
is.
health. Those are the things the
The
Supreme Court
fundamental
has
purpose
upheld.
of government is to serve the public good.
Right.
We've kind of lost sight of that. We focused on the economic good. And the problem with what you're talking about here with the oligarchy, it focuses the government on serving the private interest, promoting economic growth, as opposed to supporting the public good, the social good.
And it kind of tries to
And-
teach
yeah.
the public that this is the way it's supposed to be, and
Yeah.
that this other way is
Right.
somehow wrong.
And it's not radical thinking. If you go back to the Declaration of Independence, it talks about, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain alienable rights, inalienable or inalienable, among those life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that's where most people stop. But the next sentence says that to ensure these rights, governments are instituted among men, it says. That's the purpose of government, it says. You read the preamble to the United States Constitution, it says, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. And then it goes on to ensure domestic tranquility, to establish justice, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. It doesn't say promote economic growth. It doesn't say promote individual well-being. It says the
Over the
purpose
good.
of this government is to support the common good, the common
Right.
defense, establish justice, the general welfare. That's democracy. That's
Yes.
not. I call what we have now a corpocracy, which means that corporations rule by corporation as opposed to rule by individual people. I think there are oligarchs here. There are a small class of people who are in positions of power, so that fits. And it's also a plutocracy in the sense
Right,
that
it
they
is kind
tend
of
to be
multiple.
wealthy. But I think what's new about it is, as I explained before, a corporation is not a real person.
Right.
As long as you have real people, they at least have the capacity for social values and ethical values. But when you have rule by corporation, it becomes a purely economically driven society. And one thing I want to address before we move
there.
totally off of food, and it ties in with what we're talking about, is we're being subjected to a disinformation campaign that has never been experienced in history, because we've never had all of the means of promoting it, and we've never had the money behind it to promote it. And so we're being told and convinced of things like you were talking about being labeled socialism or communism that are not socialist or communist at all. They're pure democracy. And we've been led to believe that the Constitution is all about individual rights. It's about social responsibilities as well as that. But in the area of food, one of the biggest disinformation is what you mentioned a while ago, is that we have to have corporate agriculture to feed the world, that we have to have industrial agriculture. Well, the reason I supported kind of this industrial model of agriculture, specialized, standardized, consolidate, for as long as I did, is because I was told and I believed that we were going to make good, safe food affordable for everyone. I've concluded after all these years that it has been an absolute failure. It's failed in two main regards. We haven't fed the hungry. We have a higher percentage of hungry people in this country today than we had back in the 1960s. About 15% of our people, according to the statistics, are in food insecure homes, meaning they don't know if they're going to have enough money to get through the end of the month. Almost a quarter of our children here in the most affluent country of the world live in homes where they're not sure that they're going to have enough to eat to the end of it. That agriculture didn't feed the hungry, and a market-driven economy never will, because people are hungry because they're poor, and industrializing agriculture made more people poor rather than making more people wealthier. In addition, maybe even a bigger problem, is those people that can afford to eat, particularly on the lower income scale, their food is making them sick. We've got an epidemic of obesity and related diseases, of diabetes and high blood pressure and heart disease and a range of cancers that are associated with the American diet. When we were reducing the percentage of the average income spent on food in half, we were doubling the amount that we were spending on health care. We now spend twice as much on more than twice as much on health care as we spend on food. And I would argue that at least a third and probably half of that is related to the American diet. This industrial model has been an absolute disaster as far as providing food security. It hasn't provided food security for the rest of the world. But most people don't realize 70% of the people, according to the United Nations, in the world today are fed with small subsistence farms. A range of studies indicate that sustainable practices, agroecology, just basic changes in terms of understanding crop rotations, simple machines rather than working by hand, we could double, perhaps triple the production on those small operations. We don't need industrial agriculture. If we would simply work with small farmers and help them farm sustainably, economically sound, but socially responsible and ecologically sound as well, then we would have plenty of food to feed a growing population and could totally do away with industrial agriculture. There's no solid justification for this argument that we have to have industrial agriculture to feed the world. If we want to starve the world, that's probably the best model to lead us in that direction.
Right, and you know, this other model will create more jobs and more prosperity, and will feed people healthier food. It will help restore the soils as we go and do a better husbandry.
I spend most of my time now working with people in sustainable agriculture, and sustainable agriculture, like sustainability, is about a commitment to meeting the needs of the present, all the people in the present, without diminishing opportunities for the future. Mm-hmm. But I see that in reality out here on the farms, the farmers that are farming sustainably. There is at least a dozen conferences in this country now that will draw over 1,000 people a year. These small farmers and their customers, people that have this different vision of agriculture. You know, organic food gets the biggest attention, and rightly so. It was growing at the rate of 20% per year during the 90s and the early 2000s, doubling every 3 or 4 years. It's still growing more than 10%. Local food now has kind of replaced organic as the most dynamic and fastest growing section. But in livestock, there's hormone, antibiotic-free livestock that you can market. Grass-fed beef, grass-fed dairy.
Better
pastured
omega-3s,
poultry,
better for you, healthier
pastured pork,
food.
Humanely raised livestock. You know, there's a whole range of options. And these people, you know, it isn't all about making money. It's farming for quality of life. It's farming as a way of life. What I said we had to abandon, I'm saying now that we have to regain. We have to look at the farm as a place to make a living, but much more than that, a place to raise a family, to be a part of a community, a place to be a caretaker of the soil, you know, to pass the farms on to future generations, to ensure that future generations of humans have something to eat. And you were talking a while ago about, you know, young people and people throwing up their hands. I think what these farmers understand, and the realization that I've come to, that we each have a purpose in life, that we're here for some particular reason. And if we fulfill that purpose, if we find that purpose, and I think they feel they've found their purpose in farming, you can always find a way to make an economic living in fulfilling what you were put here on earth to do. It wouldn't make sense for us to be here for a reason that we couldn't fulfill. And so I think if every person, regardless of whatever it is, whether you're a farmer or whether you're in public relations or whether you're a teacher or whether you're an educator, whether you're working in a factory or in a corporation or wherever you are. You say, what's my purpose here? And I think when they really find that, it'll be to make a positive contribution to the betterment of humanity in some way. And if they live in a way that's consistent with that purpose, they're going to find a fulfilling life, and they're going to find happiness. And if we all find our purpose, then we're going to change the government, we're going to change society, and we're going to move humanity to the next higher level.
I agree.
In its evolution.
I think that's a great place for us to make sure we get that point across to young people, because they just feel, I think a lot of them, that there aren't any opportunities, but there's so much opportunity. It has to sandwich itself or, tag along with this extra struggle right now, because I think when we all find our purpose, it is about, as you say, serving the greater good. That's what brings fulfillment and what makes you feel really content. And it isn't always about money. I think people, it's easy to see, money just can't buy you happiness. It can't buy you health. These are the things that can't buy. And
well, it's certainly not about money for me. I've been retired for 15 years, and I don't charge nonprofits or educational institutions or anybody anything. I have to get my expenses because I'm living off of my meager university retirement. But I mean, I'm not doing this to make a living. I write books, but my books don't. If I had to live off my books, I would starve.
Well, I do want to tell people to go and visit Dr. Eichert, and we'll put his website up here on our program, because visit his website. He has some really great books. I won't even mention all of them right now, but they would be wonderful for a study with a group, and everyone have a book reading and then a discussion, because they are new and deep thinking. And join some others. There are other folks, even some that have historical from our MU, Dr. Albrecht, that I know you've sort of been a follower of.
Right.
But we just think that we'd like to thank you, and also know that, People's Visioning, we're all volunteers too.
Sure.
None of us
Right.
have, we have the shallow pockets, and that's, I think that on its surface even speaks for itself, because people are just dedicating their resources and finding some way to get by.
Right.
For some of us, it's tiny little get by. And so anything, the little small donations people can make to pay for the copies that we're handing out at farmers markets to just help draw people's attention. Many people do not really know what this Amendment 1 is going to do. And because of our time here, maybe we'll just post this on, we can post it on our People's Visioning Facebook group for sure, but we might even put a screen up that lets you read it. It's pretty short, but I'm not sure how short. But we urge you to look at People's Visioning, which you spell P-E-O-P-L-E-S with the apostrophe at the end of the S. Many people own the Visioning. And if you don't type it in that way, you won't find us on the Facebook group. But that way you can read the language. We'll post it there, and you can learn about how can you help with this particular immediate in our face thing that we really do need to stop. I think you can hear how bad it is, how bad it would be for this new sustainable model if it were to pass. So we are asking everyone to share, tell 10 of their friends what they've learned here today, join us if they can, whatever they can do. So,
could I just,
yes,
as we close out
you
here,
can say,
I had a list of the top 10, my top 10
Yes.
reasons, and maybe you could post that, but
Sure.
the most important reason I think ties together with about everything we've been talking about here today. My most important concern about this particular amendment is that constitutions were not designed to grant special privileges to any particular group of people, including farmers, to deprive other people of their basic human rights. And in this case, I think what this amendment has the potential to do would be to deprive rural people and the public in general of their basic rights of self-determination and self-defense. Under basic human rights, whenever we feel and have legitimate reason to feel that our health and our life or our well-being is threatened, then we have the human right to defend ourselves against that threat. And this amendment at least presents the potential of preventing people from being able to do that against the very real and present threats that appear to be there in this factory farming model of agriculture.
And the Farm Bureau is one of many supporters of this. Another group of supporters is called Missouri Farmers Care, right?
Which is funded through U.S. Farmers and Ranchers, which is funded by large agribusiness corporations and the large commodity groups and the agribusiness establishment.
Right, and Monsanto's a part of that, Cargill's a part of that. These are the big, deep pockets that we're talking about that are providing the funding to say the message they want you to hear. And the president of the Missouri Farm Bureau essentially says what you're saying by pointing out that they need this to protect them from what the people exercising their rights in Hawaii, for instance. He cites Hawaii when they're trying to counter the effects of the GMO over there and regulate with labels or bans or buffers or different things. And he cites those people trying to have their rights of self-determination as a reason to that our farmers need protecting from the rest.
Well, let me just point out very
it's
quickly
just not
that
fair
the farmers,
to
the
humanity.
people of Hawaii, remember when the big pineapple companies and the sugar companies came in and totally polluted their environment with agricultural waste to the point where you couldn't even live on those plantations for long periods of time. They did not have the right to protect themselves or didn't have the power to protect themselves from the destruction that was reaped upon their country by industrial agriculture in the past. And I would argue that those people of Hawaii have a basic right as members of a democracy to protect themselves from what they perceive to be very legitimate public health risk associated with GMOs or CAFOs or any other thing. They has to be reasonable, but the scientific evidence is growing. The science is there. You don't hear them calling for good science anymore. They used to call for good science. Now it's all propaganda because the science is piling up that's convicting industrial agriculture of very real threats to public health through the CAFOs, through the pollution of the environment, routine feeding of antibiotics. And I think the public health risks are growing on GMOs to the point where labeling should just be absolutely necessary, so that people can at least decide on their own if they want to avoid those kinds of foods in the store. And I think we don't want to preclude the possibility that if sometime in the future that we determine that GMOs are a risk because the risk assessments have not been done, then we need to have the right as members of this democracy to protect ourselves. And what the Farm Bureau people are saying, we want to take away your rights to do anything that interferes with what we perceive our right is to make as much money as we can. And it was never intended that economic rights would trump social values, ethical values, and everything else within a democracy.
And
you
the
can
public health
You
in
can go
general.
back through history, Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson and Dwight Eisenhower. All of the people throughout history, the leaders of this country, have warned against the growing economic power of corporations. And they say if we don't keep it under control, then we'll end up with what we're getting now. And what this would preclude, it would preclude the possibility of us or you in Missouri of controlling these corporations with respect to what they choose to do in agriculture. And it's not just Missouri. If it passes here, there'll be a right to farm amendment in Iowa and Illinois, Nebraska,
And they
Indiana, everywhere.
And they always talk about, outside interests, but, they're doing the same thing all over
Absolutely.
and saying outside interests from
Right.
all over. And, it's exactly what you're saying. And we hope that you've heard enough here that you clearly know that you would want to vote no on Amendment 1 and do all you can to spread the word about that and make sure that you get to the polls. Vote absentee. I've never voted absentee, but if I weren't going to be here on August 5th, in this case, I would vote absentee for sure because it's that important. It's really kind of a sea change when you put something into the Constitution. So we just urge you to make sure that you spread the word, get to the polls, help if you can. And I want to thank Dr. Eichert
Thank
for
you
being
for-
with us and go visit his website and time to get off the couch, folks. Thanks a
Good.
lot.
Thank you.